To 52 Living Ideas. I am delighted and honored to have Dr. Brian McQuay back. And we are going through his book, the ideas in his book, the new book that is going to be coming out very soon, applying Julian Jaynes' ideas to personal growth and psychotherapy. So today, Brian is going to be talking about self-authorization. Brian, please take it away.
Okay, thank you, Shrikant, and thank you everybody for joining us today. So as you can see, the title of today's discussion, self-authorization. So I'll break that down, what I mean by that. But if you look at the subtitle, who or what grants us permission for our behavior and decisions? That really is the key theme. And as you can see, it involves a very philosophical, a philosophy of mind approach. Usually people say, oh, of course, it's I or me, myself, my own self that grants permission for me to think or to act or to have an opinion about something. But if you stop and think about it, that's not really answering the question. It sort of goes around in a circle. So I'm not today, I'm not going to be very ambitious and try to answer this question, but I at least want to start a discussion. I want to put that question out there. I want to dig a little bit deeper than most people usually do when we think about these ideas of exactly what is the self, why am I doing what I'm doing, where does this sense of selfhood come from? So, as I've done in the past, I always show this slide. The only difference is that self-authorization is highlighted in red. And for those of you who are new to these discussions, the point here is to talk about the nature of consciousness from the perspective of Julian Jaynes. And in order to do that, what has to be done is consciousness has to be broken down into what I call different features. And I prefer the term conscious interiority to be a little more specific, because consciousness, I think, is a very vague term and can be very confusing. But in any case, as you can see, today we'll be focusing on the feature of self-authorization. And also, again, for those of you who are new to this, I'm taking some of the key ideas that Julian Jaynes wrote about, and I'm looking at them from a therapeutic perspective. That's really what this project is all about. That's my main line of research right now. So in any case, if some of that is not clear, just let me know later on. So let's talk about authorization. Well, for those of you who are familiar with Julian Jaynes' ideas, you'll know that he claimed that people were not conscious the way that we are today until about 3,000 years ago. And when people needed to make a decision, they would rely on what we can call divine authorization. All right, divine authorization. And of course, the word divine in this context means ancestors, gods, spirits, some sort of supernatural entity. They would give us permission to act in a certain way. All right. And we are so used to seeing religious iconography from the ancient world that we take it for granted. And we sometimes forget how important and how ubiquitous paintings and statues of a religious nature were, and how they dominated the ancient world. And I think the reason why they dominated the ancient world was because they played a political function, what we might call a social political function. So they are representing how people, usually rulers, kings and pharaohs, interacted with supernatural entities who would authorize their decisions. And when these people when these leaders and rulers would make decisions, of course, these decisions would trickle down to the priesthood, other administrators, and throughout society. So there are so many examples of this, and I think that's the problem, because there are so many examples of representing this sort of divine authorization, that, as I said, we take it for granted. We don't really peel back the layers of what is going on here. So you can see from ancient Egypt that's a pharaoh communicating with Anubis, the jackal-headed god. The other example from Mesopotamia, actually, I think it's Sumerian, dates back to about 2100 BCE, and the seated figure is a king who is greeting a sort of called a lama, a spiritual entity who is actually acting as a spiritual guide. And I could be wrong. I think the figure who is standing next to this spiritual guide, I think might be a governor. In any case, the point is that there are so many examples of this, and these are not just artistic representations. These represent an entirely different mentality. So what happened, according to Julian Jaynes, is that this sort of divine authorization could not handle social complexity. And there was a cultural evolution in psychology that led to self-authorization.
Brian, just let me make one announcement. Folks, there are lots of people who are new today. So the format is that Brian is going to present these ideas on self-authorization for about 30 more minutes, after which we're going to have a Q&A. So keep your questions ready. I strongly recommend using the technology of pen and paper to keep track of the questions that you have. And you will get to, and what we're going to do is that we're going to collect all the questions and organize them, and then give all the questions to Brian, so he will deal with all the questions at once. So please keep track of questions. If you want, you can go ahead and put the questions in the chat, and you'll have plenty of opportunity of doing interaction and Q&A after the presentation. All right, Brian, sorry about the interruption. Over to you.
No problem. Thank you. So, as I was saying, as civilizations started to break down, divine authorizations just were not up to the task because of increasing social complexity. And so what we can call a psychological revolution occurred. It actually took several centuries to put in place this idea of what we take for granted, the self. So rather than divine authorization, what developed was what we can call self-authorization. So in modern conscious times, we ordinarily believe that there is some executive ego, some inner self, some what some people refer to as a homunculus. That's sort of a miniature person inside our head, working the levers, making decisions for us. None of these explanations are actually satisfactory when we think about it. These are just labels for very mysterious, complex processes. What actually is going on when we talk about authorization, when we give permission for ourselves to act or to think in a certain way? That's, as I said, that's the theme of today's discussion. So I think in order to get a grasp on this transition from divine authorization to self-authorization, again, we always have to look at things in historical context, or in terms of historical development. Things do not make sense. And that's why in philosophy of mind and mainstream research psychology, there are still many problems. I think one of the reasons why we still have these big question marks is because we are not taking an historical perspective on certain questions. And of course, that was the great contribution of Julian Jaynes. He looked at things not from an evolutionary perspective, but more from a historical perspective, going back 3, 5, 10,000 years. But in any case, getting back to this idea of how authorization developed. So this is a gross simplification. Of course, it's much more complicated and nuanced than the way I'm presenting it. But just to get the discussion going, we can begin with pre-conscious period up until about 3,000 years ago. And up until about 3,000 years ago, of course, we had, as I already mentioned, divine authorization, where people, when they were confronted with a major decision, would, according to James, hallucinate the divine voices of ancestors, gods, spirits. There was no self as we think of it. There was no psychological self in pre-conscious times. There were, arguably, there was something like what we might call a proto-self. But certainly, if you look at the ancient historical records, no one is discussing the self the way that modern conscious people do. So right there, that one datum, I think, is very important to keep in mind. So that's the first stage when it comes to trying to understand how how authorization developed. So then consciousness developed, or conscious interiority developed. And as I already presented the second slide, there's a list of the different features of consciousness or conscious interiority. So those features, of course, are things that we are not born with. Those are things that individuals had to learn. Those are things that humans had to learn over the course of several centuries, beginning about 3,000 years ago. So one way to try to understand the role of the self, I think, throughout history, when we talk about authorization, until relatively recently, the notion that the individual self was the most important thing really didn't exist, at least not the way it does today. So in the past, we can talk about communal authorization. And the idea here is that the self was deeply embedded in religious traditions, social communities, and political organizations. So the idea here is that when someone made a decision, when their I would tell their me what to do, that decision was mediated through these different groupings, whether they were religious or political. Beginning in about maybe the 16, 17, and 1800s, of course, that idea started to break down, this idea of communal authorization. We still experience communal authorization. Of course, it's still around. We still do look for authorization to our spiritual traditions, to our families, whatever group it is, social communities. But I think what's happened is the self has become more central to how we make decisions, or at least how we perceive we make decisions. So I think this slide here is a little bit difficult, perhaps. Later on in other podcasts, I'll talk about the I in the me. But in any case, I just want to introduce the basic formulations, and hopefully some of this will be clear. So next, in what we might call postmodern times, beginning in maybe the late 1800s, early part of the 20th century, what we can call self-authorization, or a more interiorized authorization, developed. What happened is the self became detached from groups. The self became what we might call a free-floating entity in its own right. And I-me relations were highlighted, and a sort of intense self-reflexivity developed. That's very clear if you look at, for example, art. If you look at the development of the novel in the late 18th to 19th century, there's a much stronger focus on what we would call the individual. So in any case, so that brings us up to where we are now, this idea of, I just use that word for the sake of convenience, postmodern times. So from a Jamesian perspective, we can analyze the self in self-authorization. So I've been talking about this idea of self-authorization, giving ourselves permission to act. But what is the self exactly? And I have already alluded that the self must be broken down into I and a me. The I and the me are actually other features of conscious interiority. Just very briefly, the I can be understood as the active directing subject, which governs or informs or directs the me, the more passive directed object. But then again, what is the I and what is the me, right? So the problem here, it's a philosophy of mind problem, is as we peel back layers, we begin to get this sense that there is no bottom to selfhood. Or if it is, it's very unclear exactly what that is. By the way, this diagram here, this is describing the ideas about I and me from the American philosopher George Herbert Mead. And he actually wrote an awful lot about I and me. Some of my thinking actually has been inspired by George Herbert Mead. Not all of it. Some of his ideas are a little bit different. But in any case, I just thought I'd throw that up to give you this sense that not just James, but other people have also grappled with the relationship between I and me. As I said, George Herbert Mead goes in a somewhat different direction than I do. But in any case, so more broadly, some of us may assign the source of what gives us permission to act in a certain way to religious traditions, political ideologies, other systems of thought. So this is where it gets a bit complicated, because when we talk about self-authorization, we assume that the self is this entity that somehow exists in our heads. But the problem is that self has been shaped and configured by larger social forces and ideologies. Where do you draw the line between the self and society? Again, that's another very big question. I'm not going to answer it today. I don't know if there is a good answer. I'm just trying to point out the nuance and the complexity of some of these themes that we are addressing, and at least try to look at things from a Jamesian perspective. So last week I talked about self-autonomy, and that, of course, that describes the sense of control we have. But authorization indicates the who or what of agency. What is it inside me, or who is it inside me, again, that gives me permission to act in a certain way? And if you notice, I use the word permission because in the everyday world, if I decide to eat a hamburger, the idea is that I just eat a hamburger. But it's actually, that's not what's going on. What's going on is there's something inside me that has to grant permission to another aspect of myself. In other words, my I has to give permission to my me to do something. We usually don't think of things that way, but there are reasons that I think that we should. So to whom or where do we to where or where do we attribute control of our behavior? Or in a lot of the psychological literature, they talk about locus of control. This overlaps with some of the themes that we're talking about today. I thought I would just introduce it. But in any case, basically locus of control means, do I feel that I am in control of what I'm doing, or do I think someone else is in control of what I am doing? That's that's an important line, of course, in research. So now I want to switch gears and talk about the therapeutic implications of this idea of self-authorization. And the idea here is that if a therapist presents a valid, coherent, and meaningful rationale to a client, hopefully that rationale can offer authoritative structure or a good reason for the patient's emerging narrative that has new meanings about their cells. That's a very abstract way of putting things, but later on I'll try to give some examples of what that means exactly. And you can see that word narrative. In the past, I've talked about self-narratization. So you can see all these different features of conscious interiority that I've talked about before: self-narratization, self-autonomy, the I, the me, selfhood. These are all part of the same package. And what I'm trying to do is disentangle them to show the different aspects of conscious interiority. But at the same time, I'm trying to show how they are very much interrelated. And you cannot understand one of these features of conscious interiority unless you understand all of them. So one thing I learned when I first started to do therapy is that for many people, just coming to a therapy session is a type of authorization. And it's therapeutic because they're giving themselves permission to heal. And again, that is a strange way, I think, to put it. This idea that, well, of course, a person wants to heal, whether physically, emotionally, psychologically, but when it comes to the psychological dimension, it's actually more complicated than that. There may be many reasons why a person does not want to self-heal. They could be punishing themselves. There could be guilt. There could be any number of reasons. But in any case, as I said, the act of at least coming to the first therapy session is a beginning of giving, of how someone gives permission to themselves to begin the healing process. So just as an example, again, within a therapeutic setting of a relatively common problem concerning how self-authorization can be distorted, is this notion of personalization. And in this context, it just means attributing external events to oneself without supporting evidence. So the idea is one blames oneself for something, even though one had little or nothing to do with the outcome. That again, that is not an uncommon phenomenon that we see with patients and clients. So just as an example, I remember during a tense session, in which it felt like no progress was being made, a patient suddenly declared, he was quite upset, that I'm stuck with myself, as if he had an insight. So I asked him to talk about what he meant by that. And he said in a very dismissive tone, I don't feel comfortable with myself. And then things seemed to make sense for him on what he had to do to find out how to be comfortable with himself. And then that way he could give himself permission to heal. He could give himself permission for other authorizations, for other decisions that had to be made in order to improve his life. So again, on the surface, it doesn't sound very profound, but if you peel back the layers and look at these things carefully, you can see that the way the human psyche works, the way our different aspects of ourselves, of our self, communicate with each other, is by giving permission to do this, to not do that. And sometimes we have to find out why someone is not giving themselves permission to do something. So this falls into this theme of loving yourself, which it sounds a little new agey perhaps, but I think it is important. I actually think there are a lot of people who have issues in their lives because they don't like themselves. Perhaps love is too strong a word, right? But you at least have to begin by liking yourself before you can heal, before you can give yourself permission to act in healthy ways. So I think many times attempts to escape from reality or something about reality that we don't like is motivated by how, because we don't like ourselves, we can't deal with ourselves. We don't know how to treat ourselves. But as I already pointed out, you can't really come to terms with yourself until you start to like at least some aspect of yourself. And this can all be formulated in a more precise technical manner by talking about how our I views our me's. And when I talk about me's, of course, that could be some aspect of ourselves. It could be a role that we've been playing. Perhaps we're not aware of a certain role we're playing with other people. But in any case, the idea here is to come to terms with what is it about myself that I don't particularly care for, and to discover how is that keeping me back. So much mental distress, I think, has been caused by a failure to appreciate how many of our problems originate in how we relate to ourselves. Many people have difficulty dealing with others in a healthy way, or loving others, because um, they do not have the ability to accept and to respect themselves. So when we say to love ourselves, we're not talking about a sort of unconditional, a sort of falling in love with ourselves. To love ourselves means to accept everything about ourselves, good and bad, and then authorize making decisions to change what needs to be changed. So the word love here sounds a little too gooey, I think, for my taste. I think a better term would be accept, self-acceptance. Related to this present discussion is this idea of self-forgiveness. And learning to forgive oneself is really about authorization for a mental act. And of course, obviously, that can be related to liking or disliking ourselves. So this is more than just making a misstep, but it concerns, it may concern serious personal challenges, whatever those challenges might be. This is a type of self-compassion. And again, self-compassion is not about falling in love with oneself passionately in a sort of selfish, self-centered way. Rather, it's about accepting ourselves. There are many people, I think, who do a very good job of liking, respecting, loving other people, but they may not necessarily like themselves. So forgiving another for some transgression, of course, can be a difficult thing. However, the point is, forgiving oneself can be much trickier. Right? And again, we're not talking about making excuses for oneself. Right? We're talking about accepting oneself, warts and all. Self-forgiveness demands recognition of one's failing or failings, but it also means an acceptance of oneself in a way, of course, that can be very challenging. And it requires a genuine humility, what we might call a self-humility. So in the words of one patient, don't ask what your recovery will do for you, but what will you do for your recovery? In other words, put yourself in charge. So the idea here is self-autonomy, but also self-authorization. This patient he was having a problem finding work while he was receiving treatment. So he said, I have no resume except a strong back. And this was in the context of how he was talking about his efforts and his failures to find employment. He went on to explain that eventually he realized that he could not depend on others to find work. And again, for many of us, that may not be a big deal. But for this particular individual, because of what he was going through in his life, it was a grand insight. And he realized that he had to do more than just polish his resume. He had to authorize himself to take the initiative rather than relying on other people in order to find work. He eventually did find work. But in any case, he had to give, as I said, permission to himself to do whatever he had to do. So I've talked about self-authorization, looking at things from historical perspective, from pre-conscious times, this idea of divine authorization. And by the way, this is a bit of a digression, but I think it's worthwhile I try to emphasize how in pre-conscious times there was no notion of religion. Things were beyond religion. The atmosphere in pre-conscious archaic societies was one of super religiosity. There was no distinction or division between politics and religion. And even the common names that people gave themselves quite often pointed to this super religiosity. So whether you look at ancient Egyptian names, ancient biblical names, names in Mesopotamia, commonly people would have as a component of their name God or the gods. And there, I could give many examples from Egypt, from Mesopotamia, but I'm just right out of the Bible, some very easy examples. Daniel means judged by God or judgment of God. Eli, that's a variant on the name of God or my God. Ezekiel means God will strengthen. Israel struggles with God, or some translations, Prince of God. Michael, it's actually I guess it's a question. Who is God like? And then those names all have L in it, El, which meant God, it could mean, actually it could mean Yahweh, or it could mean it could mean other gods. But in any case, other examples: Isaiah means salvation of Yahweh. Jeremiah means Yahweh exalts. Jonathan, gift of Yahweh. Joseph, Yahweh has increased. Joshua, Yahweh saves, or Yahweh is my salvation. So the reason why I'm just throwing all these examples out is to show that in pre-conscious times, there was no notion of self-authorization. Even your name was about being tightly linked or tied to some sort of divine entity. So in any case, as I said, so we looked at self-authorization, or the lack of self-authorization in the ancient world. Then we talked about self-authorization. Then I looked at things from a therapeutic point of view. Now what I want to do is just very briefly look at the political implications of this idea of self-authorization. And what happens many times is the self becomes subsumed, becomes part of the group. And we can talk about authorization of the group. There may be some benefits, of course. Homo sapiens very much is a species defined by group living. We can't escape from groups. We learn to be what we are from groups. But of course, we all know that group behavior can get out of hand. And this is related to this idea of self-deception. So what happens is self-deception can operate at the same time at the level of the individual and in the collective awareness of some group, whether it's political, religious, or even within families, right? We sort of develop a distorted view of what's going on because we're engaged in some sort of self-deception, and the group is making it more and more difficult for us to see things clearly. There's nothing really novel in this observation. We see it throughout history. We see it going on all over the world today. But in any case, I think it's worth pointing out. So group membership establishes a tacit agreement neither to notice personal feelings of uneasiness or misgivings when the group is doing something untoward, nor to question anything that challenges the authorization of the group. So what happens is self-authorization is eroded. People stop making decisions for themselves. People stop developing and learning, making progress. And it's so much easier for people like that to hand their authorization over to the group, not the gods, but to some group. And in fact, you might say that in these situations, the group becomes a type of deity, becomes a type of God when people lose individual decision-making ability. Okay, so I'm going to end there, and I'll be interested in hearing people's reactions and questions.
Wonderful, folks. All right, so it's time for Q&A. We've got 4 rules. As always, go ahead and type exclamation mark in chat or raise your hand in Zoom in order to ask a question. Rule number 2, keep on topic. Rule number 3, be brief. And rule number 4, feel free to disagree with anybody on anything and do so courteously. So we are taking only questions at this point. Go ahead, and if you have a question, go ahead and type exclamation mark. We're going to collect all the questions so Brian knows the shape of questions that are out there. And then we will go ahead and try to answer all the questions. And as the questions begin, Brian begins to take the questions and answer them. You can keep on, lining up for more questions. All right, so go ahead and type exclamation mark if you have a question. I'm going to start out because there is no questions yet. I mean, there is a question by Su Ting, but we'll come to that. I'm going to organize more questions. So go ahead and type exclamation mark if you have questions.
In the chat?
Yeah, you have a question. Go ahead, ask. Go ahead.
Okay. Yes, it's the first time I come to this group, so I'm a bit uncomfortable because I don't realize what you have done before. I was very interested by the whole introduction. I didn't realize that this was going towards psychotherapy, so I was more interested in the first part that was not the therapeutical part. And I really, I just wanted to make a remark on the fact that there is sort of prehistorical times with authority from the kings of the gods, et cetera, et cetera. Then there's a second time, which I'm going to come back to, and then there's the postmodern time. So I'm going to the second one. In other words, I'm not quite sure what the name of the second part was, consciousness, yes. My question would be, this consciousness period, which lasted between, let's say, 2,000 to 3,000 years, maybe 5, not probably less, people got educated in groups of people, got more were more sedentary, got organized in religions, in different groups all over the world. And then when we're looking at the postmodern part, we're actually talking of the last 200 years or 250 years maximum. So my question is, how important would Brian say that the structures of what we learned during those, let's say, 2,000 years or 2,500 years, how important are those structures still today?
Wonderful.
In other words, our notions of time, our notions of destiny, our notions of rhythm, there are many, many deep things which still continue today, however individualistic we are. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Michael. So that's Michael's question. Let's see, Craig, can I get a copy of 2 joined circles? Okay, you're just asking that. Okay. Su Tang, can you go ahead and ask your question as well?
Yes. So my question was, so at the beginning, you were saying that in the ancient time, people are not as conscious as we are nowadays. I just wonder how we realize this.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think the side point I want to make is it possible that simply in ancient time, the writing is not so available for most of the people. So even if they are conscious, we couldn't know. And then kind of their awareness is decided by people with power and like people who give them names like belong to God or that kind of thing. So yeah.
Wonderful. How do we know? Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is Cheryl. Cheryl, what's your question?
Well, it's kind of building on what Su Tang said, because I was thinking about the invention of writing and some of the work with the pre-Socratic philosophers that once we had the technology of writing, we could start thinking about thinking and analyzing what we were thinking. And I was also thinking about the authorization of the gods, because in those paintings, you mentioned that it was the rulers that we see. And I wondered if you could say anything more about, and I don't know how we would know this, but the everyday lives, people who were just the ordinary people, their authorization came from the gods as well, correct?
Yes. So the question is, how did authorization work in the everyday life in those kind of pre-conscious times, right?
Yes, and is there a kind of a Jungian connection? Do those stay as archetypes?
Okay, wonderful. Anybody else wants to put a question on the table at this point? I'm going to give another about 10, 15 seconds. Otherwise, we're going to start. Jeff, go ahead.
Thank you, Brian. Again, just a wonderful presentation. You know, given everything that is kind of there in the historical evolution of self-authorization, and given the more recent history and kind of where you think we are today, do you have any projections of what might be the next steps in this journey?
Okay, excellent. All right, so Brian, what I'm proposing is that let's just take this in, these questions naturally fall in a historically chronological order. So we will take with the question about, how do we know about these pre-conscious times? What is the source? How do we figure out what happened at that time? What was the everyday life during that time like? How did most people act? Not just the kings and the priests, but everybody else. How did it work with them? What happened during the time between that and what you call the postmodern time? And how do echoes of that reverberate today? What role that played today? And looking forward from today, what do things look like? So we can take that one by one. So first is about how do we know, because that's a core part of the work of Julian Jaynes. So we can start with that.
Okay, yes, that's a big question. It's an important question. So yes, we do have writings, we do have records, textual records of how people engage with the world from different parts of the world, especially from places like Egypt and Mesopotamia. But if you study those records carefully, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to find what I would call modern psychological sentiments. And we have to be very careful because there's actually a lot of poor translations out there. And what happens is a modern translator will say, well, this person is not using these psychological terms, so I'm going to insert those terms in the text to make it more readable for the modern reader. And that has led to a lot of problems. And I would also say that when we look at these historical records, we're looking for patterns. And really, that's what science is about. Science is not about anecdotes. Science is not about an example here, maybe another example there. Science is about accumulating enough examples that patterns begin to emerge. And if you look at the ancient world, you definitely see those patterns. So there's many examples I could give, and in my writings, I've written about these examples, of course, if you're interested. But for example, philosophy, the way we think of philosophy, there is no record of philosophical thought before maybe about 800 BCE. And yet, people started to write about 3,500, maybe 3,000 BCE. People were writing about all types of things, except what they felt in a very psychological, deep sense. And they did not write about philosophy. They did not ask deep philosophical questions. And the reason why they did not until about 800, maybe 700 BCE is because they simply were not capable psychologically. They did not have the culture yet to ask those questions any more than they had the cultural knowledge on how to build a nuclear reactor or 747. There's just no evidence of it there. So, so I hope that that's clear. If not, of course, you can ask me again for other examples. But Shrikant, so what was the next?
Okay, next question. So once you're done with the one question, just prompt me and I'll give you the next question.
Sure.
So the next question is, what was, there is a mentality that the kings would have and the way in which kings would operate during this time. How would an everyday person, like a common person, act, and how would it be different?
Right. So this is an important question because many historians will point out that actually most of the archaeological remnants, most of the historical texts that we have were written by and usually for elites. And so the problem is, are we only getting the worldview of the upper political strata? And I would say probably not, because actually, for example, in ancient Egypt, there were periods when the middle class, a sort of what we would call middle class, economically developed. And yet these people did not write down what we would call, they did not engage in a deep psychological analysis of themselves. There's no evidence of consciousness. And again, if you want to know, these words are very vague. So just to let you know, if you want to know what I mean by consciousness, you go back to today's presentation, the second slide, where I list those features of conscious interiority. So when I look at ancient records, that's what I'm looking for. And we assume that those features must be in all these ancient records. The truth of the matter is it's very difficult to find them in any clear-cut manner. And as I said, you don't start to find what we call conscious interiority until about the 7th, 8th century BCE. And I think that for what seems that the picture that emerges, I think, for most people, the common people, and remember, most people could not read or write actually, but there still is enough archaeological evidence to show that they were part of this. Even though they were powerless, they nevertheless accepted this elite view of the supernatural world where gods would tell people what to do. And usually at the local level, among common people within families, they would communicate not directly with the high gods, the way that, for example, the pharaoh would. Rather, they would communicate with their ancestors. And that is why all over the world, ancestor worship exists and is so important. And I would make the argument that actually ancestor worship was probably the first religion of humankind. It's been erased in certain cultural traditions. So, for example, Christianity was against ancestor worship. Actually, to a degree, the Judaic it comes from the Judaic tradition too, though there is evidence of ancestor worship among the ancient Israelites. But in any case, that's an exception. Most places around the world, some sort of religiosity that targeted the ancestors was key. And so it seems to me that if you look at the ancient record, most of the time, people were not, unlike the pharaohs or the rulers, were not communicating directly with the gods. That was the purview of the people on top of the social, political, religious hierarchy. Most people would communicate with ancestors or with local deities.
Wonderful. Cheryl has a fantastic follow-up question. So when people did write, and it was not philosophy, what did people write? When you look at the early writing across the world, what is the writing about?
Yeah, so the earliest writing in the first places that emerged were, of course, from Mesopotamia and Egypt around the same time. But the first writings in both those places were, from our point of view, about very practical things, about economics, about how many sheep, about how many bushels, about how much to harvest, taxation, very practical things. However, we have to understand that those issues that look so economical to us were really religious, because it was about how to divide up wealth among the gods in the temples, the priesthood, the rulers, and then the common people. So, even something that looks very this worldly, looks very economic, actually had a religious function. And then a bit later, a lot of the writing was what we would call prayers and hymns to the deities. You don't find anything what we might call secular writing until again, it depends what you look at, maybe 6th, 7th century BCE, and that's sort of a gross simplification. But the point is, almost all writing up until the time people became conscious, about 1000 BCE, was religious in tone. There was no notion of the secular. There was no, and that's another thing that amazes me, but many people don't even think about. There was no questioning of the existence of the gods in any tradition until about, again, it's just a number, about the 8th century BCE. Up until around that time, up until about 1000 BCE, the gods were assumed to exist. People would get mad at the gods. They would question decisions made by the gods. They would complain to the gods. They would complain about the gods. But there's no questioning that the gods existed anywhere in the world. And right there, that one piece of evidence, I think, is a powerful illustration that people simply had a different mentality, what I call a super religious mentality.
Wonderful. Next question is on the era that you call the community authorization. So the question is, what was that like, and what from that era is what we are still living with? What are the repercussions of those? What are the reverberations of those? What are the ideas, habits, parts of our culture that come from that era? Go ahead.
Yeah, so that's a big question. And so I would say that so when the reason why I came up with the term communal authorization is because I wanted to emphasize how people did not really begin to develop, at least at the mass scale, a profound self-reflexivity until the past maybe 200-300 years. And up until around that time, the community, whether it's defined politically or religiously, usually religiously, was more important than the individual. And that's a feature of the modern, postmodern world, putting emphasis on the individual. And that is a psychological act. But with that said, of course, even today, even in our very postmodern, very self-individuated way of living, communal thinking, communal authorization still plays a very, very big role. It has not been forgotten, and I don't think it ever will be forgotten, because communal organization simply is about being a member of some group or wanting to be a member of a group and getting your authority for your own actions from a group. That's always going to be with us. What's different, what is developing, and I think it's increasing in intensity, is this, for lack of a better term, a sort of psychologization, to psychologize everything and everybody. I think that is increasing, but it's increasing on top of this this sense of community and I think, we hear a lot about that lately. It's actually not a new idea. Back in the 19th century, social theorists started to write about the breakdown of communities. I mean, that's what sociology, for example, to be specific, in the French tradition with Emile Durkheim, was all about. It was about trying to find something that was being eroded by industrialization. It was being eroded by the loss of religion. It was being eroded by the growth of this new science called psychology. How do we return to community? That's a theme that is still with us. So these are not, so a communal authorization and a self-authorization they're not really opposites. They sort of interact in a complex way, and we'll always have this need for community. It's just that it seems to me there is a deeper sense of, again, it's difficult to come up with one term for it, but this sort of introspection, self-introspection seems to be playing a very increasingly important role. Maybe introspection is not the right word, but I think the term that I would use is interiorization, interiorizing the person and granting us more and more space within the individual.
Wonderful. Michael has a follow-up question. Michael, go ahead. You can unmute yourself and ask the question.
Sorry. No, I was just trying to wonder how much of the let's say pre-enlightenment times, to make a very long consciousness, what you call consciousness, how much has survived in our different ways of thinking the world, of being in the world and being in time, being in space. Our social relations are very, very determined by this pre-enlightenment period, which lasts maybe 2,500 years.
Yes, so thank you for that question. And not to plug my own book here, but I actually wrote a book that directly addresses that. So if you want, you can contact me later and I'll be more than happy to send you a reference for the book. The title of the book is The Psychohistory of Metaphors. And it looks at how ideas that we take for granted, such as time, space, and the nature of selfhood, have dramatically changed, not just from ancient times, but even the past several centuries. And this is not clear unless we look very carefully at what we mean by space, what we mean by time, because these seem like commonsensical categories of thought, but they're not. So for example, just to take one example with space, in the modern world, we assume that space is infinite. We assume that space is homogeneous. It's the same everywhere. And space is like a container that you fill things, you fill space up with entities. That's not how they viewed space in the Middle Ages. Space was not infinite. Space, the quality of space could change depending on what part of the cosmos you were in. Space was not mathematicalized as it is today. So that's just one example. Time also, of course, we know that throughout history, most civilizations view time as cyclical. But beginning maybe in the 1700s, depending on where you want to look, time increasingly became viewed as traveling in an arrow, having a beginning, a middle, and an end, and going on forever. and also related to time, was a complete social and political redefinition of what time meant. So before modern times, before the modern period, the idea is that societies will pretty much always be the same, that human nature can't change, societies won't change, only in a sort of in a prosaic, unimportant way. But beginning in the 1800s, we had this idea of the future, that humankind can radically re-engineer our social institutions, our economic systems, our political ideas. And that, of course, is a legacy that we live in. We have inherited that legacy now in 21st century, this notion that the future will be better. But this idea that there is a future rather than time being cyclical is really based on a very ancient idea. In a sense, it's based on this notion of utopia. That's why if you look at science fiction, you can categorize science fiction. It's either about a utopian future or it's about a dystopian future. Usually it's about a dystopian future. So that's just another example. And none of this is clear unless we look very carefully at what people actually thought about time and space.
Excellent. Let's take a question from Cheryl. Cheryl, go ahead.
Okay, I was struggling with this. I was just thinking about the way we define stress and anxiety in the modern world, and with this whole notion of the self, I am responsible for my actions, or even with cultural events that we recognize are beyond our control. And I was thinking about it, a world, if you were born and you were authorized by your gods or ancestors, what did stress or anxiety or fear look like in that world? Were you afraid for or of the ancestors or gods?
Sure. Yes. So of course, in pre-conscious times, people experience stress, they experience anxiety, and a lot of religious writing is about the stress of your God not answering back right away, or giving you an answer that you don't like. But in modern times, when people have conscious interiority, the nature of stress, the nature of anxiety, and in fact, all emotions are different. And James actually talks about this. He has this theory, what he calls the two-tier theory of emotions. So the first tier is just basic affect, or very basic emotions that we share with people in ancient times. But as we became conscious, we started to we were able to stretch out and imagine emotions in a way that's not necessarily healthy. So for example, in the ancient world, people might become angry, but perhaps that would not lead to hatred. But in the modern world, we take that basic emotion of anger and we turn it into something else, because we've been given this space, this mental space where we can think about the past of what someone did to us, and we can think about the future of what I want to do to them. And so emotions have become more complex. We have a richer vocabulary to describe our emotions than people did in the ancient world. So just the example that you brought up, the two examples, stress and anxiety. I think even in the past half century or so, if you look at the therapeutic literature, there's more attention given to things like stress, because people, it's almost as if we are encouraged to be stressed out more than our predecessors were. So it's actually a much more complicated issue than I'm presenting it, but I hope that answers your question. But most, to sort of recap the important points, most definitely people, of course, experienced emotions like stress and anxiety in pre-conscious times. However, in modern conscious times, we have we escalate those emotions to places where they should not go necessarily.
Thank you, Brian. So we got one more question, and folks, if you have more questions, go ahead and type exclamation mark. So this is a question from Jeff. Jeff, you want to take a minute to elaborate on the question or restate it about what things might look like in the future?
Shrikant, I just entered that. Thank you so much for that consideration. I just, as Brian, as you were speaking, I entered into the chat kind of, a number of refinements regarding my general question, just for consideration there. So, it sounds like this. Are there any factors or dynamics or functions that seem to be emerging regarding self-authorization? Is it possible that individuals might, by a kind of predisposition or preference, be more motivated either to self-author or to align themselves with the orientations of groups? Would it be common that some groups might feel disrespected or threatened by more autonomous individuals in this regard? And are there any possible significant differences across major world cultures with regard to this subject?
Fantastic, fantastic. Thank you, Jeff. Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, so again, it's an important question. And as far as looking at things cross culturally, yes, of course, there are differences. Some societies, even today around the world, will take their religious sentiments more seriously. In many places around the world, family plays a bigger role. That does not necessarily mean, that's not a value judgment. That's not necessarily a good thing or bad thing. It's just an observation of what role does the kinship structure play as a type of group authorization. And these are things that are constantly changing throughout history. So I think with it's actually very difficult in a scientific way to divide group authorization from self-authorization. Reason being that we are socialized into so many different groups, and we get so many messages and so much information on how we should behave as a self. So it's not easy sometimes. However, I think recently, if you look at developments around the world, for example, how people have reacted to COVID-19, how this has been very much a politicized issue. People seem to join groups, and right there, I think that shows us how authorization can be a very misguided, can be a very emotionalized issue. It seems that people are not necessarily thinking very clearly. They're just my opinion, they're ignoring science, they're jumping to conclusions. So group membership, we have to ask what is the function of group membership? Why do I want to be the member of a certain group? And certainly if you look at the political spectrum, both left and right, there are extremes, and people usually start acting in an extreme manner, or they adopt extreme views because they perceive, maybe a misperception, but in their minds, they perceive that their group or their dignity has been assaulted by other forces. And this is the only way that they can register their voice. This is the only way that they can be heard for many people, is by joining groups that, and as I said, this often leads to a type of bipolarization of society. It leads to extremism. So I'm not sure if that answers directly your question, or if you need elaboration on anything.
Thank you. No, it's a very large area to cover, and wonderful. So thank you very much, Brian. I think this was excellent. And Brian, next week I'm going to be traveling, so we can't do a meetup next week. So we'll see you 2 weeks from now. and
Okay.
looking forward to it. I think this book, the series on this book is, speaking to many people, and just the level of interaction is fantastic. So thank you very much, everybody. We will see you. There is one more meetup at 2:30 if you would like to join. So thank you, everybody.
Okay, thank you.
I would just